Hello and welcome to the AgCulture Podcast, where we share insights about the future of agriculture. Each week we dive into the stories, technologies, and ideas shaping a sustainable and profitable future for farms and rural communities alike. I'm Paul Windemuller, host of the AgCulture Podcast, and today I had the pleasure of interviewing one of my favorite guests. He's back on the podcast, Mr. Aidan Connolly. Aidan is a world-renowned speaker, author, and president of AgriTech Capital, located in North Carolina. Now, Aidan is well known for being a thought leader in the agri-tech space and speaks especially about the advent of AI in agriculture. Now, we had Aidan on the podcast just under 2 years ago. And with that episode, we really looked at the advent of AI and what that was going to look like for agriculture. And this week, we're going to take a look at his role as an investor as president of AgriTech Capital, and how the revolution of AI has changed or not changed his perspective on who and how he invests in agritech. So whether you're a farmer or an agtech founder or an input supplier to farms, I think you're going to find relevance in this conversation no matter where you sit. So with that, let's get to today's episode with Aidan Connolly. Aidan, welcome back to the podcast. It's good to see you again. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for inviting me back. We mustn't have done too bad a job on the first go-round.
Well, people seem to enjoy listening to you the first go-around. And last time we talked, I looked back and it was 20 months ago, which is almost a length of a career in terms of AI, right?
Certainly in AgTech world it is.
Right. And we really looked at and kind of mapped out what we thought AI in agriculture was going to do from a 30,000-foot view, right? But today, I want to go back to a conversation that you and I had in Fort Worth at the Animal AgTech Summit down there back in, I believe that was April this year. And that was right at the beginning when there's a lot of actual AI upsets really starting to happen. And I really want to dive into that in this episode and how you're thinking about that, how you're looking at investing into ag tech companies and actually being willing to write the checks to support those companies' growth. So we've got a vast array of diversity in our audience listening. We have ag tech founders, we have farmers, we have input suppliers across the gamut. So I think it'd be really interesting to look at this opportunity or the segment of the market and really look at it from what does this mean to a farmer? What does it also mean to the ag tech founder? So with that, I'm going to start out a question that I asked you at the AgTech Summit, which was, what is the competitive moat that you are investing into as an AgTech investor? But before you answer that question, I think it'd be probably a good idea to look back at your career. You had a long time spending the beginning of your career at Alltech and watch that company go from, I think, somewhere around the $20 million revenue mark to over $2 billion revenue mark. So a very big growth time at the company while you were there. So what does that look like in a historical agricultural company like Alltech, what their competitive moat was? And we'll start there and then we'll play into the discussion for today's AgTech.
Yeah, the competitive genius of Alltech was, and I believe still is, the ability to translate innovations into real solutions and convince people to try them. And in agriculture, those last couple of words mightn't seem that important, but that's the essential problem. We have great ideas, we've got great technologies, but somebody has to convince somebody to try it. And with a history of foo-foo dust salespeople arriving on the farm, farmers are naturally skeptical of what they see when you drive up the laneway, when you walk onto that farm. So from that perspective, the ways in which that happens traditionally have been belly to belly. A person who is relatively older and looks like the farmer and is probably male was the person who's the conduit of the transfer of confidence that this innovation was going to make that farm money. And of course, once you get one farm or a farm area using a technology, then that becomes the testimonials, that becomes the transfer that occurs to convince others to try it, early adopters, the classic model. I think we saw in the Alltech days that we spent a lot of time on trying to understand how to communicate the innovation in a simple way that explained what the technology was, to explain how to make money, to explain how to be confident that it was going to work every day, not just on a Monday and a Wednesday and a Friday. We talked a lot about how to show that, to have that trust that the technology was going to provide a cost benefit. And finally, we focused on what else we could do for that farm to help that farm make money in terms of the overall enterprise. So I've often called that the 5 C's. And we talk about being clear in terms of what our idea is, being transference of confidence by showing its consistency, the cost benefit, the clarity of what the technology is, and then finally this consultative part of how it can make that farm make money overall. And I think that's very true. I wrote an article for Forbes on the same thing. I think that's very true for any type of AgTech innovation. Those 5 C's are extremely relevant. Some people focus just on, let's say, the technology and what it is and don't understand. If you cannot summarize the idea in 3 or 4 words, you lose the audience very quickly. Showing how it's going to make money is important, but also showing that it's going to make money every day and not just on an occasional basis. And thinking more broadly about how you might help that farm or that producer make money is a very important thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that's a great starting point for this conversation. So how has that changed now with the advent of AI? Is that enough to be a competitive moat today, or has that really shifted a lot in your mind?
There's a lot of depth within what you just asked, so I'm going to try to tackle it. Let's start with AI. The use of AI, the explosion in AI, the use of LLMs and agentic AI is extraordinary. And the speed with which these models, you hear of Gemini or Claude or releasing a new model which is 6,000 times faster than the model they used last week. That speed is hard for the average person to comprehend. At the same time, the adoption of AI in agribusiness, I'd say agribusiness more than agri-food on the farm, is still relatively slow. Now, we are all using it in our lives in different ways, and that seeps or leaches into the rest of our business. But the fact is, we're certainly not capturing everything it is. And where AgriTech is and where the problems of AgriTech are and where the opportunities are, I would say is independent of that AI problem for the moment for me. I don't think AI is accelerating it per se. I think that AgTech have specific challenges. We have a limited number of, in my view, livestock technologies which are solving that problem. Maybe 10 or 15, but the vast majority are still struggling with the same issues we described in our call, 20 months ago, 2 years ago, and the basics of what they need to do are still the same as well. So I think in terms of AgTechs, my advice is look at 3 things. Look at making money with the product you have. So get to break even as quickly as possible. This has not been the traditional model. Everybody was modeling it on Amazon and saying, so long as it's big enough, it doesn't matter that you're losing piles of money. That is not true today. You have to have a product that works, that somebody's willing to pay for, and you have to have a pathway to profitability. I think you need to be clear on what your exit is going to be. You need to be clear on who you're going to sell this to if you're going to sell this technology, or else you're going to continue it forever, which means you're back to owning or having a traditional technology. And assuming that you don't see a pathway to an exit and you're not capable of reaching break even or profitability, then you need to be capable of reducing your costs and staying alive. And those 3 things are true today. It is rare that you'll find a tech startup that's still got the pockets to continue investing or losing money for the long term, particularly if it's a significant loss. It's very easy when you're involved in AI or you're involved in tech, hardware tech in particular. It's not difficult to be spending 200, 300, 500, maybe even $1 million a month in terms of burn rate. And that's really not tenable for most of the companies out there. If I look at the AI scenario, I don't think AI makes that particularly better or happen faster. So from that perspective, I don't know that I agree with what I understood to be your original question, that AI is perhaps going to keep these companies alive. But it is extremely valuable to those that have reached, like I named in a recent blog on LinkedIn, I named companies that I felt had valuations of $100 million plus. But instead of calling them billion-dollar unicorns, we call them centaurs or $100 million companies. And these $100 million valuations, typically those businesses of maybe turnover, sales, reoccurring revenue of maybe 10 million a year, and they're making money or breaking even. Those companies can use AI to scale faster. Those AI companies can use AI to reach more customers, add more functionality, and to integrate with the existing, I call it ecosystem of other technologies, so that you feed into the data platforms that a farmer is using. All that can happen more easily with the advent of Claude, with the advent of Gemini, with the advent of ChatGPT. But if I'm a startup, I don't see generally that's making enough of a leap forward to help them survive to a significant degree that they wouldn't otherwise.
So would it be fair to say that a purely digital reliant startup is going to really struggle in the future? I mean, you were just describing a lot of companies at that 100 million mark that have defensible hardware systems and sensors and things like that that are proprietary, that they've built out alongside of their AI models that they're utilizing to make sense of that data. So a purely digital platform, say a farm management software system or something along those lines, how would you look at that as an investor?
I think you need a defensible moat, as you like to describe it, and you need to be clear what is going to prevent somebody from copying what you've done. And a lot of companies who have built data platforms allowing the farm to make better decisions about when to buy, when to sell, when to lock in prices, what decisions to take from a nutrition perspective, a health perspective, how to invest more in the farm or where to invest more in the farm. Those are under threat. I mean, there's no question that Claude and others are promising to bring very inexpensive ways of replicating what they do. Conversely, to get one of those data platforms accepted by the farming public in the United States, in North America, globally, is still done belly to belly. Somebody at some stage who decided to download a piece of software onto their laptop, their iPad, or their phone to manage their farm, that decision was probably taken because they attended a meeting where they heard about it. They went to a trade show where they met somebody. They have somebody in their area who tried it and it worked for them and they tried it as well. So the cost, even if you could redesign a feed formulation software or a veterinarian management software or a cow management software for $50,000, $100,000, it's going to cost you millions of dollars of sales time and marketing push to get widespread acceptance of that. So that is the moat in that area. From a sensor perspective, if I think of companies like I'm very high at the moment on Agtech from a dairy perspective. I think they're doing a great job and growing quickly. Excite, they're working in pigs. They seem to be scaling very quickly. These are companies with sensors that you put inside the cow or you put in the ear of the pig and you see the growth occurring. Their challenge is that hardware is hard. Their challenge is that it is also possible that you could have a Chinese company arrive with, I'm working with a robotic company. At what stage does the robot arrive from China at a cheaper price? Of course, that's also a possibility. So we always say distant fields are greener. You know, you'd like to be farming the neighbor's farm because they look like they've got better soils and better land. You have the same problem in AgTech. You can assume that your business is more at risk due to AI. But I think every business has its own challenges. And if you smartly and successfully, AI can be the way that you keep the others out.
Do you think there's an opportunity in the market for a company, like historically, I think of my milking robots. I bought my milking robots, the hardware piece, and it came with a very powerful, at the time, software system. And actually the software system was part of their competitive moat at that time, right? But do you see the opportunity for a company that does really well at building out the hardware side and the sensors and being able to just produce raw data, not necessarily even having the software platform that would feed into whatever AI model a farmer wants to build their own system on?
Of course, but now you're taking me into the dangerous territory of who owns the data and how does data get used.
How'd you know I was taking you there?
And how
the
clean
question,
is
right?
that data going to be? And I also don't want you being boycotted by any, advertisers on the channel or whatever. So
I think it's a real question, though, right? It's something that's going to be facing the industry.
If I'm a Delaval or a Lely, or if I own a controller in a poultry house for temperature, I have access to extraordinary information. And that data is incredibly valuable. And that data could provide tremendous insights into the health of a cow, the way, whether I'm feeding her effectively, the health of my chickens, am I ventilating at the right rate? But there are other things that will come that will also kind of reinvent all of this as well. And I imagine those leading companies will be part of that as well. From my perspective, I think that farms do want to get as much value from that data as possible. And they want to be told, look, maybe you're not making the right genetic choices. Maybe your culling policy is not effective. Maybe the ways that you're managing this disease, and remember, disease includes even subclinical diseases like the after effects of avian influenza. Did that drop my feed consumption and my milk production? And what were the implications of that when I tried to change my diets to address it? All of that's the complexity that we're trying to deal with. And I think mining the data that we're getting from those robotic milkers or even from the milking parlors is an extraordinary opportunity to do great things. And the companies could provide the data as raw data. I'm sure most farmers would say, if you were willing to mine that for me and give me insights, that's even more valuable. Why would I have to figure out how to take the data from this and send it to a specialized group that have an AI platform that can interpret that for me? Why don't you interpret it for me and I'll pay you, or else I'll buy your next machine and I'll be more. That's where the opportunity lies.
Okay. All right. Now, one other thing that I wanted to address and get your perspective on how you think it could affect agriculture. There's been a lot of news in the past few weeks about frontier labs that are targeting their best clients, the ones that are really the leaders in fields like healthcare or law or coding, those type of companies that were built on top of these frontier model platforms, and those frontier platforms going after those businesses and really cannibalizing their best clients. Now, do you see that happening in agriculture? What is your thoughts around that concept?
Frankly, I think we're too far back from that at the moment. We actually wish that was a problem. There will be undoubtedly risks when we start to use LLMs, large language models, such as ChatGPT and Gemini. And I get asked regularly at conferences, well, who owns the information? When I do those requests, when I do those queries, when I write those prompts, do they have access to those prompts? They do. Could they share those prompts with other people? They're not supposed to. Is there a way to protect myself? I'm not sure. I believed that when you use the paid models, the $20 a month models, you were protected in a way that you're not if you're using the free model. But that's not always as clear cut as it should seem. And clearly, if through my prompts, I ask a lot of questions about, take a simple example, how to write a grant for my farm, or what price I should be paying for my land, or what price should I pay for my neighbor's farm. Potentially, the way I write those prompts and the information I feed into it to get the right answers, potentially that could be used by the next person writing the same question. So I do think that as we start to put more and more information into these platforms, potentially that can be used against us. I don't see that happening today because a lot of times the information isn't as robust as it could be. In other words, I'm saying a terrible thing, that because our data is so bad, because there's so many holes in it, I often joke that the reason why we have hallucinations in AI in agriculture is not because they're making it up, it's because we've given them the wrong data sets, imperfect data sets. So from my perspective, I don't think it's a huge threat to us today. But of course, as we become more and more digitized, reading the fine print about who owns what will be very important, particularly for the ag techs that build based on that build their platforms, build their programs based on that, then they're going to be particularly at risk of somebody who's doing that service for them, out innovating them with a similar or better product later.
Right. Do you see it as maybe a potential resurgence opportunity for farm nutritionists and farm advisors, where it's easy enough for them to learn how to code these things up relatively quickly and be able to provide that type of service? And then they have all of that information, which took my nutritionist, an hour and a half to just compile that data manually. Now it's already there to look at in one spot in 5 minutes, and they can see what's going on. Do you see their role in the industry is changing and having a place? Because everyone was talking about, hey, they're going to be replaced by AI, and I think there's probably more opportunity for the good ones.
Yeah, I know that on Sunday I'm in Toronto and I'm going to be speaking at a conference on AI, and there are going to be a lot of nutritionists in the audience. And if I say we're going to replace nutritionists, I'll be escorted to the door and sent back to the States. But the truth is, it is going to blow it all up, because a lot of how nutrition was done in the past did involve really spreadsheets and least cost programming and knowledge about what ingredients values probably were versus what the book values were. So I think it does make the smarter people smarter. I think it makes the better people capable of spend less time on really stuff that's maybe more clerical speed and accuracy and move into using their brains. But it also potentially means we'll have less. have fewer. So the best ones will take on more farms, more clients, and feed more animals. And weaker ones will probably, frankly, go away because you could do a better job even online without having anybody come out to visit you. And I imagine you're going to see more nutritionists actually going to see the animals, to see the farms, to see what's actually happening and making decisions based on that. But I should be taking NIR or better real-time information on what the actual ingredient values are, the actual toxins in my feed are, how those ingredients interact when they're in the stomach, the rumen of a cow. I should be interested in all of that. Disease, a lot of times we're reliant upon perceptions and prior knowledge and maybe having seen a disease recently on another farm. Again, you imagine AI can revolutionize a lot of the basics of what a veterinarian does and start to really create this next generation of super veterinarians who go into health in a very, very different way.
Yeah. I think it's going to be a great opportunity for the very best, as you said. So I think that's really who's going to win out of it all. Getting back to you as an investor, looking at these companies, what is the biggest opportunity or thing that really invigorates you to invest in these companies right now that you're looking at?
You know, all of us involved in investing are certainly investing more cautiously than we did before. And that's not Aidan Connolly. That's any VC I speak to. Typically, to put it in context, the typical VC probably looks at 600 deals to choose one. And frankly, at the moment, they're probably looking at 1,000 deals to choose one. So don't be insulted if you feel like as a startup, you're kissing a lot of frogs and not finding the prince. It's a universal problem. I would even say it's a beyond agriculture problem. Investors that I work with can put their money in a bank and they can get a 6% interest rate on their money, or they can take a risk and put it into a startup. And a lot of them have said, well, why would I take a risk? So the barrier or the bar that you have to surpass is greater than ever before. And we certainly are looking for businesses that can quickly show that pathway to profitability, that can show actual customers using the product, the names of the customers, the phone numbers of the customers that I can call and say, is this working for you? And if so, how did it make you money? And be convinced that that's a universal problem, not just a problem for that farm. So I think a lot of us are thinking that way at the moment. But again, also to be clear, with relatively few exceptions, a lot of the funds are spending the money they have, supporting businesses that they've supported in the past, which is not a good place to be in. And that is true, I'd say, outside of fintech and maybe AI tech. That's true in a lot of different tech businesses. We view it as being an agricultural issue, but it's not just an agricultural issue. So if you have an idea that you think is worth, that you've invested in, think is worth growing, I would still advise be cautious how much money you put up front into it. Establish that this is not just a problem you're solving for your brother or for your mother or for your sister or your dad, that this is something that a lot of farms need to solve and that the cost benefit justifies it happening. A profitable AgTech company with the ability to scale will receive funding. They'll probably receive funding not just from VCs, but they'll start to see funding coming from private equity groups, from family offices. It'll be a lot easier to take it from friends and family when you know that the business is already capable of making money. And you'll probably find others, including even governments that, you know, by governments, I mean government, states, etc., who'll be willing to help you. But without that pathway to profitability, it's going to continue to be a tough market until interest rates come down again. And as I said, money in the bank is not quite as attractive.
Do you think having that mindset is harder to do if you're focused just on one sector, like beef or dairy or poultry? Does that company really have to be able to scale outside of one sector?
It's just too expensive to do everything. So I spoke to a poultry company this morning. They've got a fantastic tech for chickens. They're thinking about using it in pigs, but they've, in my view, correctly surmised that if I have success in poultry, let's continue with poultry. Let's get it to the stage where we've got our Series A, raise the money and use that money then to think about what else we might do. My own experience with Caintus was we were very active in dairy. We started looking at pigs and very quickly came to the conclusion that the pigs were going to cost as much again as we'd spent on dairy. So better to double down on dairy than it was to expand into pig. And I would have the same advice for just about every startup. Even prior to this current situation, I would have said focus is a critical parameter in terms of being successful in tech. And I look for focus, and I've asked other investors and they say the same thing. They say, if I see an unfocused startup, there's one I in particular remember, they're involved in dairy, and during COVID, they decided they were going to go after a problem relating to humans. And it seems so attractive to do. And I understand why. But that was the presumption, was COVID was going to last forever. And you had to believe that COVID was going to be, as it happened to be, longer than we expected, but a 2 or 3 year problem. And then it goes away. And now you've built a business for that. In the meantime, you've become distracted from something you were successful in. And by the time you return to it, it might be too late. You've spent all your money. Anybody that's ever worked with me will tell you that focus is a big word that I like to use early and often in a meeting.
No, I think that's great advice. Outside of your investing work in ag tech, what are you most excited about that you're seeing down the road here with AI and ag tech?
I'd like to be an advocate for AI. I'd like to be a missionary or somebody that at least makes people think about how they're using AI and where they could be using AI. I know I've had audiences that really enjoy when I speak about it. I've had audiences that go silent and ask me no questions at the end, which is not a good feeling. My intent would never be to frighten people. It's just to say, you need to get on this bus, because the bus train, mixing my analogies here, the train is leaving the station and you don't want to be last to this. You don't want to be the last to get on that train. You don't want to be last to get to the party. You want to be on this thing. How you use it will, to a large degree, depend upon your ability to have clean data. That's a very easy thing to say and very hard thing to describe, because people go, well, what's clean data? Well, clean data is that you're not writing things into a copybook and then taking them back to your computer and entering them on a Friday, data that you collected on a Monday. You know, what are the risks that that information will be wrongly entered, and therefore that the AI will struggle? It'll give you the wrong answers because you have the wrong data sets. So clean data, to my mind, requires you to collect data as passively, autonomously as possible. So as much as possible, collect it directly from sensors and devices. I think that's a very, very important thing. So yeah, I spend a lot of time writing, speaking at conferences. Keynote speaking is something I like to do, and speaking to farm groups, speaking to tech groups, speaking to investor groups about where this is going. I'd also say in some of these conversations, get a lot into the conversation about energy and, you know, how much energy is this going to require, and is it going to require a lot of water, and how is that going to affect what goes on again from a farming perspective. And I try to bring a very positive perspective to that and say, you know, as farmers, we should perhaps be thinking of our farms as being future power plants. We should be thinking about how that farm maybe could not just suffer from the use of energy and AI, but perhaps be an energy generator and be part of the creation of that renewable energy sources that will be critical to the future of how AI is being used.
Well, I think that's great perspective. And Aidan, thanks so much again for your time and effort in the industry. And I really appreciate your articles and all the stuff that you're writing. So what's the best place for people to find out more about what you're discussing in this world?
Yeah, so I try to write in Forbes, not as often as I wish. I write a lot of blogs on LinkedIn. I've got one coming out next week on water and different smart systems for the use of water. AidConnolly.com was launched about 3 weeks ago, in addition to the AgriTech Capital. So I try to put my thinking on there as well. And obviously YouTube, you'll find me, etc. I try to be out there as much as I can. I don't think there are many people. I think you and I are probably, it's a handful. The handful meaning probably 5 people really.
It's a small network.
It's a pretty small world, and speaking deeply about agri-technologies, food technologies, linking in what's happening to what we should be doing. I want to be that champion. I want to be that advocate for us externally, maybe helping or encouraging people to come and invest in a sector that wouldn't have thought about doing so otherwise. Really enjoy being on podcasts like this. Again, sadly, not too many of them out there, but I'd invite people to follow me on LinkedIn. That's usually where most of my initial ideas are, or when I appear someplace else, I repost it there, and on my own website, AidConnolly.com.
Well, Aidan, thanks again for being on the podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. Always enjoy it, and look forward to seeing you in the near future at another conference, or maybe back here.
Definitely. Well, thanks once again for listening to another episode of the AgCulture Podcast and this interview with Aidan Connolly. If you're interested in AgriTech, AI, anything of that nature, I strongly encourage you to read Aidan's writings. He's a great author and has a lot of wisdom when it comes to this field. And as always, thanks once again to the friends of the show that help support what we deliver to you every week. Check them out on our website, as well as in our LinkedIn newsletter that we send out on a weekly basis. And with that, we will see you next week for another exciting episode of the AgCulture Podcast. Thanks for listening.